Hello and welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Our feature today is 1968's horror classic Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero. Night of the Living Dead concerns the fate of a small group of people trapped in a deserted farmhouse, trying to survive the attack of an army of the undead. This film has been called a watershed moment in the history of horror films, and I'm not going to disagree. Night of the Living Dead opened, for better or worse, the doors that on-screen gore, soon to be tagged splatter, had been hiding behind since 1963. Before I talk about Night of the Living Dead, let me tell you a little bit about the first real splatter film. Way back in the summer of 1963 at the Memphis Drive-In, I remember almost seeing the trailer for a movie known as Blood Feast. The reason I almost saw it was because, being all of 6 years old at the time, I hid my eyes when I wasn't peeking at the screen from between my fingers. My older brother Michael, however, watched it from beginning to end and lovingly filled me in on all the details that I was too scared to watch. I ended up having nightmares for months. Herschel Gordon Lewis and David Freeman were filmmakers who specialized in what were known as nudie cuties. These were stag films that involved nudity with bad jokes, worse acting, and no sex. They're very innocent by today's standards, but in the late 50s and early 60s, they were a hot item. As the Hays Code, Hollywood's self-imposed morality standard adopted after the Fatty Arbuckle scandal in the 20s, began to fall by the wayside, the market for nudies began to shrink to a point where it was no longer profitable. Lewis and Friedman put their heads together and began to search for a taboo subject that they could exploit in a film, and they came up with gore. They quickly wrote a script, came up with a budget of what looks like about $30, raided the Playboy Club in Miami for their female talent, turned over a few rocks to find the rest of the cast, and released Blood Feast on the drive-in circuit in the South. It was a huge smash and was followed by 2000 Maniacs, a Brigadoon-like story about a small southern town wiped out during Sherman's march to the sea during the Civil War. The town and its people come back every 100 years to take some particularly violent revenge on northern tourists. Color Me Blood Red, the third film in the Blood trilogy, was about an artist who just can't find that particular shade of red he desperately needs to finish his masterpiece until one of his models taunts him a little too much about being too slow. These films were pretty much slapped together without much thought other than to make a quick buck, although 2000 Maniacs does show some style. They made their money and were forgotten fairly quickly, although their influence lived on, in a lesser form, in the films made by Hammer Studios in England. Mainstream American horror films, on the other hand, were either uninspired dreck like The Blob with Steve McQueen, or tales like the Roger Corman Poe films. These movies were based very, very loosely on the stories of Edgar Allan Poe and usually starred Vincent Price. The first time I ever heard of Night of the Living Dead was when I read an article about it in the Reader's Digest written by none other than Roger Ebert. He had gone to a matinee showing of the film on a Saturday afternoon, and the theater was filled with children who were apparently very traumatized by its content. He was outraged by it, and of course this made me want to see it as soon as possible. Night was released unrated, which was unusual at the time. The Motion Picture Association of America had been in place since 1922, and the major studios voluntarily submitted movies to receive the production code seal, which was kind of like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval for movies. When MGM released Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up in 1966, and the film was refused a production seal because of nudity, they released the movie without the seal through a subsidiary and made a bundle. The MPAA, then headed by Jack Valenti, felt that it had been hamstrung and, in the interest of the changing attitudes of the time, dumped the old production code in favor of a rating system. In the mid-70s, with the release of Jaws, the MPAA ratings code was revised. G was still there, but GP was added and changed a few years later to PG for parental guidance. M was dropped, and R changed to patrons under 16 must be accompanied by an adult. X remained X, although since it was the one rating not copyrighted by the MPAA, it had become a definition for a genre rather than a rating. As such, it carried a certain stigma in the mind of the public since it was associated almost exclusively with pornography. It still stood for adults only, however, and if a film submitted for rating received an X no matter what the content. It was and still is death at the box office. In 1990, the MPAA responded in a rather backhanded way to the pleas of producers, directors, and critics by creating another rating meant to replace the X, NC-17. In the minds of the public, though, this new rating still meant the same thing, so it's still undesirable, and producers will, to this day, release movies unrated rather than risk box office failure by getting an NC-17. In spite of repeated pleas and protests from filmmakers and critics to create a V for Violence rating, the MPAA maintains that NC-17 is good enough, although that's clearly not the case. Night of the Living Dead was shot in Evans City, Pennsylvania, and surrounding areas by a company known as the Latent Image. They had been making regional commercials and industrial films for a number of years and felt a bit stagnated. One afternoon, George Romero, the company's director, and John Russo, the copywriter, were having lunch and discussing their dissatisfaction over having to bow to the whims of clients, when Russo suggested making an independent horror movie and financing it themselves. After all, they already owned their own equipment, so the biggest expense would be film stock. There were 10 people in the company, and if they each kicked in $600, they'd have enough seed money to get started. Romero had written a short story adaptation of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, and they decided to use that as a jumping-off point for the script. Russo took over the writing duties from Romero, and they cast the film with friends, fellow employees, and business associates. Critics made a pretty big deal about Dwayne Jones, who played the role of Ben, being black. In 1968, a film with a black hero was unheard of, and the casting of Dwayne Jones was seen as a socially progressive move on the part of the filmmakers. Romero and the others involved in the production, however, were quick to admit that race had nothing to do with the casting. Jones was simply the best actor who auditioned for the part. They did, however, change the role to suit him. The original character was a crude, uneducated, but resourceful truck driver, and that didn't fit the personality of Jones, who was a refined, intelligent young man. His is probably the most professional performance in the film, and he helped sell the premise. After Night, he was quite active as an acting teacher and stage director. He died of heart failure in 1988. Judy O'Day, who plays Barbara, was born in Pittsburgh and was an accomplished stage actress at the time she appeared in Night. A few years after making this movie, she apparently retired from acting. I say apparently because I was unable to find any biographical information on her anywhere. Carl Hardman, who plays Harry Cooper, was the president of Hardman & Associates, a production company involved in mostly radio programs and commercials. He worked closely with George Romero in The Latent Image and was one of the original 10 investors in the movie. In addition to acting and in producing the movie, he photographed and hand-developed all the publicity stills, and like the rest of the cast, built props, moved lights, did makeup effects, and attended to all of the 1,000 details necessary to make a film. His daughter Kyra played Karen, a little girl bitten by a ghoul. Marilyn Eastman, who plays Helen Cooper, was the partner of Carl Hardman and co-produced, in addition to playing several ghouls in the course of the movie. If you look close, you'll recognize her as the ghoul who eats the bug off the tree. Night of the Living Dead kicked off the midnight movie showings that flourished in the 70s and 80s and since have sadly gone by the wayside. One of the fondest memories of my misspent youth was getting together with a bunch of friends and hitting the Westwood Theater on Friday or Saturday night and seeing whatever they chose to offer. There was usually a poster-like handout at the shows that listed coming attractions for the midnights. And it was at these shows that I was able to see the movies that I had heard so much about from the Fangoria or Cinefantastique magazines I collected, along with a good amount of real direct that I otherwise wouldn't have ever known about. There are probably a dozen or so different versions of Night of the Living Dead available on tape and DVD, but if you would like to see the definitive version of this movie, try to find the Elite DVD release. It's the best copy of this I've ever seen and includes 2 excellent commentaries by the cast and crew, as well as a good number of supplemental features that will tell you more about this movie than I possibly could. As a personal addendum, I had the great pleasure of meeting the cast of Night of the Living Dead at a B-movie convention, and I'm pleased to tell you that they are all very nice, funny, normal people. So right now, turn off the lights, sit back, relax, and enjoy Night of the Living Dead, right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.